Evio.
Sic Semper Tyrannis, Booth's famous proclamation in 1865, shared by Brutus standing over the slain body of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. But where did this phrase come from, and how did it enter the lexicon of rebels and freedom fighters the world over? The answer may surprise you. The words themselves are Latin, of course, but the origin of the phrase is decidedly not. It's not a pocket-sized idiom like carpe diem, which has existed for thousands of years, and there is no actual record of Brutus issuing this poetic denouement. He was rumored to have uttered the phrase after leading the dagger-armed Senate mob to murder Caesar in Pompey's theater on the Ides of March. But Shakespeare wrote no such line in his play Julius Caesar, published in 1599. In fact, there is no account of anyone writing the phrase Sic Semper Tyrannis until the late 1750s in pre-revolutionary America. There are a few early American political figures the phrase could possibly be attributed to, but as for the origins, or more accurately, the inspiration for the phrase, we must turn to Homer. In the Odyssey, Homer gives us a line that roughly translates to, "Bring death to all that act like him." If nothing else, the passion and sentiment of the line is reminiscent of Sic Semper Tyrannis. But it's not quite the succinct, digestible, three-word motto that would have the kind of legs to find a place in the vernacular for generations to come. That usually requires some design. Consider one potential author of the phrase, George Mason. Mason was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. He was well educated and even had a seat at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Mason studied the classics and would have been very familiar with the works of Homer. It is believed that through the course of his political musings, he often considered the fate of rulers who were considered tyrants. Men who rose to power through extra-legal means used their influence for personal gain, or who acted in ways that were contrary to the will of the people. It's likely that Mason, realizing that a tyrant's reign usually ends in blood, saw an opportunity to coin a phrase. Simply put, it's not just bad Latin, it's not Latin at all. It would be like picking three words from a Spanish dictionary and arranging them in a way that would make sense in English. It's a reverse-engineered catchphrase, and the creator chose Latin, most likely, for the historical gravitas afforded by that dead language. And it worked. Within a decade, Sic Semper Tyrannis was officially adopted as the motto of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Then the Brutus-Caesar attributions began. Finally, a century later, John Wilkes Booth would stand center stage at Ford's Theater, bloody dagger raised above his head, and recreate a scene from history complete with a catchphrase that never actually occurred. Welcome back to the Ides of April. I'm Alec Baldwin. Episode 6, Sic Semper Tyrannis. As we progress through this section of the story, it's important to consider Booth's state of mind by the time he reaches Virginia. Fortunately, we have an incredibly accurate account of what Booth was thinking from his own journals. We ended the previous episode with what would be Booth's last journal entry. In those words, we can feel defiance, confusion, despair, and finally, acceptance. Booth is honest about his fading hopes in all their astonishing grandiosity before coming to grips with reality. In this final document, he longs for the honored status of Brutus, who saved Rome from tyranny in the most honorable way possible, that is, with the least amount of violence. It didn't require a war that would demand the lives of thousands and the depletion of Roman reserves, blood and treasure, as they might say. Brutus spared Rome that terrible fate by killing the tyrant and was honored for it. Booth also compared himself to William Tell, the Swiss revolutionary and timeless folk hero. This is the treatment Booth expected: hero status. The story goes that William Tell ran afoul of an occupying Swiss governor. Rumored to be a crack shot with a crossbow, Tell was forced to shoot an apple off his own son's head in exchange for his parole. Tell was successful in his attempt, but the governor noticed he had pulled 2 bolts from his quiver. When asked to explain, Tell told the governor if he had failed and killed his own son, the next bolt was for the governor himself. Tell was able to escape and, as promised, was able to assassinate the governor with a long-range shot from his bow. A death that provided the spark of rebellion that would lead to the Swiss Confederacy. Booth biographer Terry Alford.
Well, in looking for historical and literary models, obviously the Julius Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius thing were very big in his mind. I mean, 6 months earlier, he had played Julius Caesar to a huge audience at the Winter Garden Theater in New York. And he had heard the sentiments of Brutus cheered and applauded by the audience. But it applied to Lincoln, who was a democratically elected governor of a great nation, put in by proper electoral means, and was, as people had found out, and some knew, and many, many more learned during the war, a nice guy. I mean, he was a decent person. He had no bitter feelings toward the South, right? He was as kind and compassionate, I think, and humane as his situation would allow. In fact, I've often thought that was one of the really fortunate things, that we had that particular guy, who didn't have a mean bone in his body when you really came down to it. To compare him to a dictator didn't seem to make a lot of sense.
After these lofty, erroneous comparisons, Booth jumps from playing the victim, "I knew no private wrong, behold the cold hand they extend me, and I have given up all that makes life sweet," then throws a little blame again on the government before condemning the brutality of Powell's attack on Seward and beseeching God's forgiveness several times. Then, in the final third of the journal entry, he seems to accept his new role in the unfolding drama, villain. Perhaps the most celebrated villain in American history, but a villain nonetheless. He writes that he feels abandoned with the curse of Cain upon him. Cain, as we know from the biblical story, murdered his brother Abel, the favored son. As punishment, God condemned Cain to wander for the remainder of his life. The previous days had certainly given Booth cause to make that comparison, and not just the wandering, the murdering of the favored son as well. This plot twist that Lincoln would become more loved, more revered, more powerful in death was completely unexpected and something Booth was wholly unprepared for. The last comparison Booth draws might get past the casual listener. However, it's more obvious when Booth's entry is read in black and white. The reason is because of a line that Booth put in quotes, indicating that he was repeating the words of another. In this case, it was the second-to-last line Booth wrote, "I must fight the course." This line is uttered by Macbeth, arguably Shakespeare's greatest villain, and it foreshadows his ultimate demise. It concerns the barbaric practice known as bear baiting, where a bear would be chained to a stake to be more easily hunted by a cowardly human looking for a trophy. Booth obviously knew the Scottish play intimately, and this lets us know that he felt paralyzed, unable to escape, and yet unwilling to give up. The full line reads, "They have tied me to a stake. I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course." This line is perhaps the greatest insight into Booth's mental state as the events of the next 48 hours unfolded. His brazenness, his absurd courage, and his utter refusal to surrender. His character arc from hero to villain was complete, and now the story just needed an ending.
Booth wanted to get to Mexico. There was a civil war going on down there, right? The French were occupying the country. Some Southerners were beginning to move down there to escape living in the North, or perhaps some of the things they had done during the war. They wanted to get out of the country. In fact, leading Southerners were heading out of the country in every direction. They were going to Canada, going to Cuba, going to Europe, going anywhere they could go. So he wanted to get to Mexico if he could, but that's a very long way, right? So step one, I suppose, would be, he did fall in with this network of Confederate agents and spies who lived between Washington and Richmond. Today you go to Washington, from Richmond to Washington, right down I-95, right? It's a straight shot. But in the older days, before Washington became a substantial city, you went from Baltimore, so you kind of cut down through the Maryland countryside. It was an old, well-established pattern. Very southern region, had slaves both in Maryland, and slave culture, people enslaved, and the culture that went with it. So there were quite a few Southern sympathizers down there. Some friendly, some just willing to hand him off as a hot potato to the next person.
Finally, in Virginia, Thomas Jones' contact, Elizabeth Quisenberry, proved, while helpful, ultimately dismissive. A sure sign of things to come, Booth and Herold had become radioactive. No one dared be around them for too long lest they incur the wrath of Edwin Stanton and his manhunters. Quisenberry prepared food and had an associate arrange for horses to transport the men to the next stop. By this point, possibly to allow those who assisted them some plausible deniability, Booth and Herold had concocted a story about there being Confederate soldiers returning home, and Booth's injury was sustained in battle. But this ruse didn't pass muster virtually anywhere they went. By now, news of the assassination, the nationwide manhunt, descriptions of the fugitives, and the recently increased reward to $140,000 had saturated Virginia's northern neck. There was nowhere for them to hide. They were relying completely on the kindness of strangers and the stability of the Underground Rebel Railroad.
As they got further into Virginia, they got across the Potomac successfully, got down to the next big river, the Rappahannock. While they were waiting to cross, 3 Confederate soldiers happened. This was the first Confederates Booth had seen on this whole escape. He'd been going for like a week.
Mrs. Quisenberry led them to a farm owned by a man named William Lucas. On the morning of April 24th, 10 days since Booth walked into Ford's Theater and heard the news that Lincoln would be in attendance that evening, Booth and Herold hired Lucas's wagon and team of horses to transport them south to Port Conway, Virginia. There, they could catch a ferry across the Rappahannock River and into the very heart of the Old Dominion. Once in Port Conway, they happened upon a fisherman named William Rollins and inquired about a ride to the village of Orange Courthouse. There, they could board a train which would take them into the Deep South, and their escape would be complete. Rollins declined, but offered instead to take them to Bowling Green, only 15 miles away, with a major railroad hub just a few miles beyond that. Could he also get them across the river? Booth preferred the anonymity of private transport as opposed to the public ferry, where his exposure would be out of his control. Rollins said he could, but the men would have to wait until his nets were set. The fish were running, and he couldn't afford to miss out on a day's catch. Booth insisted they leave at once, offering double the ferry rate, but Rollins wouldn't be moved. If only Booth had found his patience one last time. As it happened, during these negotiations with Rollins, 3 men on horseback rode into Port Conway. They were soldiers, and from afar Davy Herold couldn't tell if their uniforms were gray or blue. Booth and Herold knew it was only a matter of time before they ran into soldiers, and they were prepared to fight when necessary. Harold created distance between himself and Booth, walking towards the men, his hand hidden in his coat, ready to draw his pistol. As a last attempt to avoid conflict, he called out to the approaching riders, "Gentlemen, whose command do you belong to?" "To Mosby's," they replied. To Harold's elation, they were Confederates. Davy approached the men and introduced himself as David Boyd, a Confederate soldier trying to get his brother safely home after he was injured in battle. He motioned to Booth, giving him the name James Boyd. The three soldiers could see that Booth's leg was severely injured and marveled at his ability to withstand constant pain. The Confederate soldiers were all teenagers with truly fantastic names: Willie Jett, Mortimer Ruggles, and Absalom Bainbridge. It was young Willie Jett that Harold chose to speak to. Although Jett was only 18 years old, he was battle-hardened and could spot a con a mile off. He didn't for a moment buy Harold's "We're returning soldiers" story. He pointedly told Davy that if the men wanted assistance, they must tell him who they were. Jett was ready for anything. Maybe they were spies for the Union trying to get back home, or Confederate deserters unaware of Lincoln's parole, or even common thieves on the lam. Whatever he imagined, Willie Jett could never have been prepared for the next words out of Harold's mouth. "We are the assassinators of the president." Jett, dumbstruck by this news, informed his friends, and they all joined Davy to have a word with Booth. Booth, by this point, had completely adopted his new role as antagonist in the great American drama that was playing out in real time. He knew Davy had betrayed their secret and was happy for it. He addressed the three soldiers proudly and irreverently. He even reminded them of the price on his own head. They would be rich men if they decided to turn him in. Jett assured them that they would do no such thing. They had no interest in government blood money. Indeed, Jett, Ruggles, and Bainbridge were happy, even enthusiastic, to help these men get to a train station. But first, they needed to cross the Rappahannock and find a comfortable place for Booth to rest for the night. The two men boarded the ferry and crossed in silence so as not to alert the ferrymen to their identities. Once across and on solid ground in Port Royal, Booth rejoiced, thanking God for being safe in glorious old Virginia. The story continues after the break. Right around the time Booth and Harold were being introduced to Willie Jett and his fellow Confederates, a telegram arrived at the War Department's office in Washington City. The telegram detailed a possible sighting of Booth and Harold crossing the Potomac. It was a hot lead that required action, especially considering that the majority of the manhunters were still in Maryland. If the fugitives had made it to Virginia, the game might very well be up. In reality, the men spotted crossing the Potomac were not Booth and Harold. The sighting occurred on April 16th, the fugitives' first night in the woods, but the tip was hot enough to inject a much-needed shot of urgency into the manhunt. Colonel Lafayette Baker was never far from the telegraph office after Lincoln's death. Baker was one of the detectives summoned from New York, a personal request from Secretary Stanton in those first hours after the assassination. Colonel Baker was officially an agent of the War Department. He could rely on Stanton to support his actions, and most importantly, he was eligible for the reward money should he be instrumental in the capture of the assassins. As such, Colonel Baker's tendencies towards ambition and self-promotion grew virtually unchecked during the long days of the manhunt. Thanks to the telegram, Baker had caught a break, and he moved with lightning speed. Within the hour, he had assigned the mission to his cousin, Detective Luther Baker, who would be accompanied by Colonel Everton Conger. Troops were requisitioned and approved. Within the hour, Lieutenant Edward Dougherty of the 16th New York Cavalry had new orders in hand. Assemble 25 men, each with 3 days' rations, and report to Colonel Baker.
And off these soldiers went. It was a group of the 16th New York Cavalry. They were a veteran combat group led by Lieutenant Dougherty, accompanied by 2 detectives, one named Baker, one named Conger. So you have essentially 2 policemen and a squad of 24 soldiers combing along the river. And when they got to the place where Booth had crossed, where he met the Confederate soldiers, they got lucky. A man who lived on the river said, yeah, they crossed here.
30 minutes later, Lieutenant Dougherty and his men arrived at Baker's headquarters, and they were briefed on their mission. They were to follow up on a lead that the men responsible for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln had crossed into Virginia and were at the very doorstep of vanishing into the Deep South. Dougherty and his men would join Detectives Baker and Conger on board the steamer John S. Ides. Together, they would make for Belle Plains, Virginia. Almost immediately, Lieutenant Dougherty found himself in the middle of a battle over who was actually in command of this cavalry charge in pursuit of John Wilkes Booth. Conger outranked Baker, but Baker had the backing of his cousin, who had the backing of Stanton. It made for some tense hours on the journey into Virginia. Their orders were to put in at Belle Plains and continue to Port Conway. The men scoured the countryside along the way for any signs of the fugitives. What took Booth and Herold 10 miserable days to accomplish, Baker, Conger, and the 16th Cavalry would manage in less than 24 hours. Willie Jett and his friends were true to their word and accommodated Booth and Herold the best they could. Booth had a horse to himself while the others doubled up. Of Jett's acquaintances in Port Royal, none panned out as he had hoped, and Booth was still desperate for a hot meal and a comfortable bed.
A few miles below the Rappahannock was the home of a family named Garrett. It was a Southern family that had boys in the Confederate Army who had just come home a day or two earlier. And they decided, we'll see if Mr. Garrett won't put you up for a few days, while we ride on further on and see what can be done for you. And the Garretts were obliging people, country people. They had a nice house, a large family. One more person wouldn't make any difference in the house.
As Booth and his men approached the Garrett farm, Willie Jett offered a plan. If Richard Garrett proved hospitable, Jett would make sure Booth got settled. He and his friends would then continue that evening into Bowling Green. Why? Well, Willie and his friends were young men who had been away at war and were finally nearly home. They had to see the girls they left behind. Especially Jett, who had a tryst arranged for the following day and wouldn't miss it for anything, not even John Wilkes Booth. The Garrett family was in high spirits as their 2 sons had fought for the Confederacy, survived the war, and had returned home just days earlier. As such, the ruse Booth and Herold had concocted about being soldiers themselves worked to perfection. On the evening of April 24th, 1865, the most wanted man in U.S. history found himself seated at a large family table. Overflowing with the home-cooked delights of his adopted homeland, he quietly enjoyed a robust dinner table discussion concerning the topic that was on the minds of the entire nation: himself. But where was Davy Herold? This would be the first night since April 13th that Booth and Herold were separated. Herold had decided to accompany Jett and the others into Bowling Green. Davy's boots were in dire need of repair, and he had hoped to see a cobbler early the next morning before returning to the Garretts, a decision that would prove fatal for them both. Anxious for a peaceful night's rest, Booth climbed the stairs to the second floor of the Garrett house. There he found the room that he would share with two of Richard's sons. He stripped to his underclothes and slung his gun belt across a chair. He spent that night in a comfortable bed with a full stomach and the sweet scent of Virginia tobacco wafting in from the farm, fresh in his nose. Davy, meanwhile, bunked in with Absalom Bainbridge at a house near Bowling Green. Neither man could know that the noose was tightening, that nearly 30 well-armed men were less than a day from Port Conway, where they would pick up the scent. On the next episode, Booth's Final Hours, a stunning betrayal leads the New York 16th right to Booth's doorstep. What follows can only be described as Shakespearean. That's next week on the Ides of April. The Ides of April was created, produced, and written by Brandon Morgan. Our executive producers are Brandon Morgan and Matt Del Piano. Zach McNeese is our story editor, sound designer, and mixer. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thanks for listening.